At 6:47 in the morning on June 6, 1944, moonlight draped the waters off Tawi Tawi like a thin sheet of steel. A single wake cut through it, narrow and bright, as sonar pings rolled across the surface like distant hammer blows. In the cramped conning tower of an American submarine, a commander watched 3 destroyers sweep the sea with the patience of hunters who believed the night belonged to them. His boat was slower. His hull was thinner. His margin for error was measured in heartbeats. Yet he turned toward them. Spray lifted off the bow as the submarine pressed ahead, closing the distance against vessels built to kill it. Old doctrine said, "Run deep and stay hidden." He knew the truth written in the pressure of those moments. When the hunters expect you to flee, stepping forward changes everything. What followed in those early days of June would ripple far beyond a single chase in the southern seas. 4 destroyers would fall. A major fleet would abandon its anchorage. A great battle would begin on uneven footing because of one patrol few people ever heard about. How does a single submarine bend the path of a fleet built for empire? And why did its crew believe an attack was safer than escape? We return now to the waters off Tawi Tawi. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to WW2 Secret Archives and leave a comment about which country you're watching the video from. The southern reaches of the Philippine archipelago carried a heavy stillness in the early summer of that year. Heat clung to the air like damp cloth, settling into every inlet and channel between the islands. At Tawi Tawi, the anchorage chosen by the Imperial Japanese Navy, that heat mixed with a haze of fuel smoke rising from dozens of warships preparing for a campaign that demanded precision they no longer possessed. The mobile fleet had gathered there because the waters were sheltered, the channels narrow, and the approach routes easy to defend. On paper, it was the safest place in the southern seas. That safety was more fragile than it looked. Japanese planners faced a problem they could not solve with charts or discipline. Their carriers could not operate without a ring of destroyers to shield them from submarines. Their pilots needed calm seas and clear skies. Their fuel reserves were thin, a consequence of long convoy lanes hammered by American submarines for nearly 3 years. Every gallon burned at anchor was 1 less gallon available for the carrier strikes they hoped would stop the American advance toward the Marianas. The mobile fleet gathered with the weight of expectation on its decks. 4 battleships, including a giant built for another era, sat in the anchorage. Carriers stretched across the horizon, their flight decks crowded with aircraft and crews still learning their craft. Cruisers formed the inner circle, guarding the fleet's heart, while destroyers patrolled the perimeter in tight patterns meant to keep lurking submarines at bay. This was the largest concentration of Japanese naval power assembled since the disaster at Midway. It was also a fleet on borrowed time. American codebreakers knew the anchorage was full. They tracked fuel shortages, aircraft losses, and reports of inexperienced pilots rushed into service. They also knew that if the Japanese fleet could launch at full strength, supported by land-based planes from the Philippines, the coming fight in the Central Pacific could turn into a costly struggle. The 5th Fleet needed time. Anything that disturbed the Japanese timetable would be worth its cost. Admiral Charles Lockwood had no illusions about the stakes. His submarines had bled Japanese shipping for years. But warships were a different challenge. Destroyers were fast and armed with sonar that pierced the quiet where submarines hid. Old doctrine taught caution. If a destroyer found you, you went deep and prayed its depth charges missed. Lockwood had watched too many boats vanish following that guidance. He also understood that the Japanese depended on their destroyers more than ever. Losing even a handful would tighten the noose around their already strained logistics. In that tense season, the American submarine force needed a crew willing to push past the limits of habit. They needed a commander capable of trusting instinct over tradition. They needed a boat that could slip into narrow island channels where echoes from reefs and shoals confused sonar and turned the sea into a maze. That need brought USS Harder to Tawi Tawi. Harder had just completed a string of aggressive patrols, each one marked by rising confidence in a style of attack that defied the textbook. Her commander had discovered, patrol by patrol. The Japanese destroyer captains reacted with a predictable hesitation when confronted by a submarine closing the distance instead of running away. That brief hesitation could be measured in heartbeats. It was long enough for torpedoes to cross the final stretch. It was also long enough to change the outcome of a duel between steel hulls meant for opposite ends of the ocean. The waters around Tawi Tawi offered both opportunity and danger. Depths varied sharply, dropping from shallow reefs to dark trenches within minutes of travel. Visibility below the surface shifted with sunlight, and the flow of silt from distant islands. Patrol planes circled overhead at dawn and dusk, their engines humming across the horizon like reminders of the risk. Destroyers prowled every channel, zigzagging through predictable search patterns. The Japanese believed these patterns were tight enough to screen the anchorage from intruders. Harder would test that belief. What made this moment critical was not just geography. It was timing. Operation Ago, the Japanese plan to strike the American fleet as it advanced toward the Marianas, depended on synchronized movement. Carriers would launch aircraft from carefully chosen ranges. Land-based squadrons would reinforce the attack. Destroyers would herd the fleet into position, guarding its flanks and escorting fuel ships to the front. The plan assumed days of preparation, scouting flights, and long hours of controlled movement. A single disruption could unravel that plan. Every destroyer assigned to patrol duty at Tawi Tawi played a role in holding the schedule together. Losing even one meant shifting assignments. Losing several forced the Admiralty to choose between escorting carriers or protecting convoys, between guarding their perimeter or preserving their dwindling fuel fleet. The mobile fleet could not afford delays. Yet it was anchored in a place where a patient submarine might reach out and take a piece from its armor. Harder's arrival brought that threat into view. American planners understood that the submarine's strength was not merely its torpedoes. It was its ability to appear where it should not be. It was the capacity to interrupt the rhythm upon which a fleet depended. If Harder could slip through the patrol lines and strike a destroyer, the effect would echo far beyond the loss of a single ship. It would force the Japanese to reconsider the safety of their anchorage, their patrol routes, and their timetable. It could push them onto the open sea before they were ready. Harder's crew knew the risks. Tawi Tawi was ringed by patrol zones that grew tighter with every passing week. Pilots flew constant circuits overhead. Destroyers practiced coordinated attacks, working in pairs and trios. Sonar operators were alert, knowing that any contact could be the submarine they had been warned about. The anchorage was a fortress built on the assumption that submarines would avoid its narrow waters. Harder approached with the intent to break that assumption. In the days before the first encounter, the submarine moved carefully through currents that pushed against her hull and carried her wake into brighter patches of water. Her crew tracked the rhythm of destroyer patrols, memorizing the turn intervals and the speed changes that marked a search pattern. They recorded the drone of patrol aircraft and timed their dives beneath the paths of those engines. The submarine became a shadow moving through a maze drawn by enemies who believed they had sealed every exit. The stakes rose with every mile. The mobile fleet was preparing to move. The American Fifth Fleet was preparing to meet it. Between them lay a narrow window where a single submarine could shift momentum. Harder was not sent to defeat the fleet. She was sent to disturb its balance, to cut at the threads holding its plan together, and to do it in waters where even silence could be deadly. Before the first torpedo left her tubes, the fate of carriers and pilots and far-off battles depended on whether a single submarine could slip close enough to strike without being crushed in return. The sea around Tawi Tawi was about to become the place where doctrine met desperation, and where a slow, patient boat would test the strength of a fleet poised for a major battle it believed it could still win. The sequence began before sunrise on the 6th day of June, when the sea south of Tawi Tawi held a faint silver glow. At exactly 0647, Harder moved at periscope depth, her hull slipping through calm water as the first hint of daylight touched the horizon. 3 Japanese destroyers had been dispatched in the early hours to locate the submarine, whose trail had been sighted by a patrol aircraft shortly after 0300. They moved at high speed, cutting long arcs across the sea as their sonar pings rolled outward in steady pulses. The lead destroyer, Minazuki, approached from the northeast at roughly 30 knots. Through the periscope, the commander watched her bow lift and fall. Steady in the thin morning light, Harder turned to meet her. The distance closed to just over 1,000 yards. The destroyer held her course in a classic down-the-throat angle, leaving a narrow window of approach. Harder fired 4 torpedoes. The submarine immediately drove down at a steep angle, the bow tilting sharply as the crew braced for the counterstrike. Roughly 40 seconds later, 2 explosions broke through the water. A third followed almost instantly, lifting Harder's stern before it crashed back down. Minazuki split amidships and went under within minutes. The sea calmed again, leaving only smoke drifting above scattered debris. Night fell on the 7th day of June with no moon and heavy cloud cover. Harder surfaced at roughly 0230 to ventilate and begin charging batteries. The air was warm and thick. The sea lay flat. At 0312, the radar operator called a contact bearing 095, range approximately 8,000 yards, closing fast. The target's speed, close to 28 knots, made its identity plain: a destroyer. It was Hayanami. She had been searching for American submarines since shortly after 0100 and had received orders to return to base around 0300. Her captain had begun the final transit home. Harder increased speed to reach the destroyer's radar blind arc before she could recognize the threat. The submarine pushed forward, climbing toward her maximum surface speed of just over 20 knots. At around 4,000 yards, Hayanami's radar detected Harder but misidentified her as another destroyer on a similar homeward course. That mistake lasted only moments. When the distance fell to roughly 3,000 yards, the Japanese captain realized the truth and ordered flank speed with a hard turn to ram. Harder held course. At slightly over 2,000 yards, she fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck Hayanami's starboard side near the aft magazine. The explosion sheared the stern away. The destroyer rolled nearly 90 degrees, propellers still turning as she slipped underwater stern first. Her captain and nearly 150 sailors were lost. The 8th day of June brought patrol conditions shaped by tide and terrain. The Sibutu Passage was narrow, with shifting depths and currents that could bend a submarine's wake in unpredictable arcs. Around 1400 hours, Harder's lookout sighted 2 destroyers patrolling the passage in standard formation. The vessels moved at roughly 25 knots and performed regular zigzag maneuvers, altering course almost every 8 minutes. Harder tracked their pattern from a submerged position, mapping the timing of each turn. Shortly after 1630, one of the destroyers, Tanikaze, altered heading and began a direct approach toward Harder's projected position. The distance fell to 3,000 yards, then 2,500, then 2,000. At roughly 1,200 yards, Harder fired 4 torpedoes in a spread with 17-second intervals. 1 torpedo passed wide. The next 2 found the destroyer, one striking near the bridge, the other hitting a forward magazine. The explosion was immense, loud enough to be heard inside Harder even with every hatch sealed. Tanikaze broke into 2 major sections that sank within moments. The surviving escort charged Harder's presumed firing position and released a series of depth charges. Harder dropped toward 400 feet, her crew enduring the violent pressure shifts as explosions erupted above. The submarine shook under the hammering concussions, but the hull remained intact. After roughly 40 minutes of searching, the escort withdrew. The 9th day of June began before dawn. At approximately 0500, Harder rose to periscope depth roughly 12 miles southwest of Tawi Tawi. In the dim light of early morning, 4 destroyers appeared in line abreast formation, moving steadily and sweeping the sea with active sonar. Their pings were loud enough to be heard by Harder's sound operator, even without headphones. Harder carried only 8 torpedoes. The commander studied each destroyer carefully. The lead vessel zigzagged sharply. The second maintained a consistent course. That steadiness made her the most reliable target. Harder maneuvered into firing position as the destroyers advanced. The sea held a grey stillness as the distance tightened. At 0612, with the range near 4,000 yards, Harder held fire. 3,000 yards, then 2,500. The destroyer turned toward Harder. The submarine waited through the final seconds as her bow aligned with the target. At roughly 1,800 yards, Harder fired 3 torpedoes. All 3 struck the destroyer's port side within a brief interval. The resulting explosion sent debris high into the air and broke the vessel's structure. She rolled and sank in well under 2 minutes. The remaining destroyers converged at once. Harder descended toward 500 feet. Depth charges detonated in rapid bursts. 23 charges fell in the first 10 minutes. The lights failed. Emergency circuits switched on. A pipe in the forward torpedo room ruptured, spraying seawater across the deck. For nearly 2 hours, the destroyers circled and attacked. Eventually, their depth charge supplies ran out, and they retreated north. 4 destroyers had been lost in 4 days. This sequence reached Admiral Ozawa the following morning. Each loss reduced the mobile fleet's escort strength. More important, the presence of an American submarine close to the anchorage signaled that the fleet's position was compromised. Operation Ago required precise timing. The plan called for departure around the 15th day of June, but the escalating submarine threat forced Ozawa to act. On the 10th day of June, shortly after 0800, the mobile fleet departed Tawi Tawi nearly a full week ahead of schedule. This early departure reshaped the coming battle in the Philippine Sea. Japanese reconnaissance flights burned precious fuel with limited results. Destroyer screens were scattered across multiple patrol zones, reorganizing as they moved. Supply ships lagged days behind. When American carriers located the fleet on the 19th day of June, Japanese aircraft were still launching and Japanese picket lines were still forming. Harder did not know any of this. Her final engagements of the patrol unfolded on the evening of the 10th day of June. Roughly north of Sibutu Passage, Harder encountered 2 more destroyers on aggressive search patterns. She carried only 5 torpedoes. Shortly after 1700 hours, Harder fired 3 torpedoes at the lead destroyer, striking the bow and slowing the ship but failing to sink her. The second destroyer charged. Harder fired her final 2 torpedoes. Both missed. She had no torpedoes left. Harder plunged down at emergency speed. Depth charges rained overhead for nearly 90 minutes. 42 charges detonated in total. 3 came close enough to crack gauge glass and open small leaks. The submarine held. At 1900 hours, the destroyer withdrew. Having exhausted its magazines, Harder remained submerged for another hour, then surfaced in fading light and began a slow return to Fremantle. She arrived on the 26th day of June after a 17-day patrol that had changed the course of an approaching battle. Her triumph would be followed by her loss. In late August, during her 6th patrol, Harder operated in a wolf pack west of Luzon. Early on the 24th day of August, shortly after 0453, the submarine USS Harder observed Harder on the surface, roughly 4,500 yards to the south. 2 Japanese escort vessels, CD-22 and PB-102, were closing in with active sonar. Harder crash-dived. The angle was steep. Her diesel engines were still running as she passed below the surface, leaving a long bubble wake visible to the escorts. At 0547, CD-22 delivered her first depth charge run. Several charges detonated within 50 feet of Harder's pressure hull. The stern compartment flooded rapidly. Harder attempted to blow ballast, but the flooding overwhelmed the system. At 0552, a second pattern struck directly across the weakened hull. Multiple ruptures occurred. Power failed. Darkness closed across the compartments. Harder sank past her maximum depth. The hull collapsed under the pressure. The submarine was lost within minutes. The battle sequences near Tawi Tawi, the forced departure of the mobile fleet, And the destruction of Harder near Dasol Bay drew a line across a critical season in the Pacific War. The submarine had struck when timing mattered most, and the fleet she disrupted sailed into battle unready for the fight that followed. Life aboard an American submarine in the Western Pacific carried its own quiet weight. The air inside the pressure hull always felt warm and close. The smell of diesel, machine oil, and metal mixed with the faint scent of damp clothing that never fully dried. Space was scarce. Every bunk sat above a torpedo or against a bulkhead. Every walkway was narrow enough for a single file of men. Crew members learned to curl their shoulders as they passed each other, a small gesture repeated without thought through long months at sea. For the men on Harder, routine became a way to steady the mind. The day began with soft footsteps in the dim red glow of the forward compartment. Coffee brewed in a small pot that rattled when the engines turned. The cooks moved quietly, arranging breakfast in a galley no larger than a small pantry. Men came off watch with slow steps, rubbing tired eyes, easing themselves into benches bolted to the deck. Conversation stayed low. Every sound inside a submarine carried. Every sound mattered. During patrol, silence was more than discipline. It was survival. When Harder ran submerged, the crew spoke in muted tones. Tools were wrapped in cloth to keep them from clattering. The sonar operator listened with steady focus, head angled toward the built-in headset, elbows braced on the console to reduce movement. His world narrowed to faint echoes. A distant propellee, a shift in pitch, a reverberation that hinted at the shape of a ship far above. The young men who served at those stations bore responsibilities far beyond their years. Many had come from farms, factories, or small towns spread across the American states. Few had seen the ocean before the war. Fewer still understood what it meant to sail into waters where the margin for error was measured in seconds. Submarine duty came with the highest casualty rate of any American service. They knew the risk. They volunteered anyway. On Harder, fear did not announce itself with panic. It came quietly, in the long moments between sonar pings or in the silence that followed a depth charge pattern. When the submarine prepared to engage a destroyer, every man understood what lay ahead. A down-the-throat attack meant closing distance against a fast warship built to kill them. It meant trusting the commander's judgment and their own muscle memory. It meant the knowledge that if a torpedo failed to run true or struck too shallow or too deep, the destroyer would drop explosives directly overhead. In those seconds before firing, the control room grew still. Officers leaned over plotting tables, whispering range and angle. The helmsman steadied the bow. The diving officer watched depth gauges with a hand resting on the trim wheel. No one raised his voice. No one broke the rhythm. Years later, survivors from other boats would recall those moments as the quietest in submarine life. A silence so complete that even the low hum of the electric motors felt louder than it should. When the order to dive came, the calm broke. The bow dipped. Loose items shifted. The hull creaked as pressure increased. Men braced their feet and gripped the nearest handhold. Above them, destroyers pounded the water with depth charges. The explosions hit like heavy fists. A bright flash might shatter a bulb. A pipe might burst and spray cold seawater across the deck. Cork insulation drifted from the overhead. Each concussion rolled through the compartments like a giant breath pressed against the steel. Yet during the long minutes of an attack, fear mixed with a disciplined focus. Crew members checked valves by touch. They steadied equipment. They whispered damage reports into the intercom. Every action mattered. When the sonar operator called out echo fading, a slow breath filled the control room. The destroyers had moved on. Harder lived to fight again. Between attacks, life settled back into its confined rhythm. Men wrote letters knowing they would not be mailed until the patrol ended. They swapped stories of home, sometimes in quiet tones, sometimes in short bursts of laughter that eased the tension of long days in the deep. A radio man might read a worn book between transmissions. A machinist might tune a pump that never quite behaved. A cook might prepare a meal meant to lift spirits on a day when the submarine had endured too much. They were young, yet the sea made them older than their years. During Harder's most dangerous patrol, the crew learned to read the commander's expression as much as his orders. When he stepped into the conning tower, they sensed the shift in air. When he placed a hand on the periscope grip, they understood the geometry of the next few minutes. Trust ran through the submarine like a current. They trusted each other to load torpedoes in darkness. They trusted each other to hold the boat level during a crash dive. They trusted each other to stay calm when the hull groaned under the weight of deep water. The cost of that trust was never hidden from them. They knew the names of boats that had not returned. They remembered the stories told at Fremantle or Pearl Harbor when a submarine was declared overdue. A patrol might last weeks. A loss could last a lifetime. Harder's final moments in August carried that weight in full measure. When the submarine crash dived south of Dasol Bay, the crew moved with the instinct of men who had drilled for every emergency. They heard the first depth charges explode above. They felt the stern shake under the force of the near hits. Compartment after compartment filled with the sounds of strain. Men braced against rails. They worked without panic, even as water surged into the after section. They fought to press the submarine upward. They fought to keep the boat alive. Darkness came quickly. The pressure outside grew relentless. The hull failed in the space of a breath. For the 79 men aboard, there was no time for final words. Only the knowledge that they had given everything the sea demanded of them. In the decades that followed, families kept their stories alive. Letters were saved. Photographs were placed in frames. Children and grandchildren visited memorials. The men of Harder were remembered not for the steel they served in, but for the courage they carried through narrow passages and deep waters. They were remembered for their steadiness, their labor, and the quiet bonds formed in a world most people would never see. Their legacy lived in more than patrol reports and citations. It lived in the understanding that heroism on a submarine was not loud. It moved in silence, in confined spaces, and in the hands of young men who held their fears in check while the ocean pressed against a thin hull of steel. They served knowing the risks. They served knowing the cost. They served together in the deep. The news of Harder's June patrol did not reach the American public in real time, but its effects moved swiftly through naval headquarters across the Pacific. At Pearl Harbor, analysts tracked each radio report with growing attention. The sinking of one destroyer was notable. The sinking of 2 in 2 days raised questions. The sinking of 4 in 4 days forced a strategic re-evaluation. The pattern revealed that a single submarine, used with precision and aggression, could alter the rhythm of an entire fleet. American commanders recognized what the Japanese understood only after the damage was done. Destroyers were the backbone of any carrier screen. They guarded flight decks from submarine attack. They escorted supply convoys. They conducted search patterns that allowed carriers to operate with freedom. Each destroyer removed from the order of battle left a hole no aircraft could fill. When Harder broke the defensive ring around Tawi Tawi, she did more than sink hulls. She forced a fleet to move. In Washington, intelligence officers studying the shifting Japanese deployments saw an unusual acceleration in fleet orders during early June. Reconnaissance flights from the Marianas confirmed the dispersal of Japanese vessels across a wider stretch of ocean than expected. The early departure from Tawi left supply ships trailing behind. Carrier formations stretched thin. The Japanese plan for coordinated operations weakened before the battle began. As Harder returned to Fremantle to rearm and repair, the consequences of her patrol played out across the Philippine Sea. American carriers maneuvered into position with better fuel reserves, better intelligence, and a more stable screen of escort vessels. Pilots flew with confidence born from preparation rather than haste. When the Japanese fleet was sighted on the 19th day of June, conditions favored the American side before the first aircraft had launched. The contrast between the two fleets reached beyond the water. Newspapers across the United States, unaware of Harder's role, focused on the dramatic scale of the unfolding carrier battle. Reports from war correspondents described American aviators meeting waves of Japanese aircraft with disciplined formations and superior training. Radio broadcasts carried early summaries of the fighting, noting the remarkable loss ratio of Japanese planes to American planes. Few civilians understood how much of that imbalance stemmed from the disarray caused by early fleet movement. Within naval circles, however, the connection was unmistakable. Dispatches sent to Admiral Lockwood emphasized the strategic value of Harder's actions. Her aggressive style reflected a broader shift in American submarine doctrine, a philosophy that embraced risk in pursuit of decisive results. Submarines were no longer limited to avoiding destroyers. They were learning to challenge them, using precision attacks that forced surface ships to react under pressure. This evolution shaped the final year of the war, especially as merchant shipping dwindled and the Japanese Navy struggled to protect what remained. Around the world, Allied observers noted the rapid collapse of Japanese carrier strength following the Philippine Sea battle. British naval planners in London studied American carrier tactics and reported that Japanese air power had suffered losses from which recovery appears unlikely. Australian intelligence briefings noted the decline in Japanese convoy traffic and the increasing difficulty of supplying distant garrisons. The shifting balance of power across the Pacific was visible not only in headlines, but in the silence along sea lanes once busy with Japanese shipping. For American families, the war continued as a distant storm. They listened to radio broadcasts describing victories on islands with unfamiliar names. They read casualty lists and telegrams delivered to neighbors' homes. Few knew the names of individual submarines. Fewer still learned the details of patrols conducted in deep water far from shore. Yet submarines played a role that shaped the very rhythm of the conflict, striking supply lines and warships alike. Harder's impact was felt most strongly among the sailors who served aboard other submarines. Her patrol reports circulated through training rooms and wardrooms from Pearl Harbor to Brisbane. Commanders studied her firing solutions. Young officers analyzed the geometry of each attack. The lessons became part of a growing confidence that American submarines, when used with boldness and precision, could challenge surface fleets directly. This shift influenced patrol tactics across the Pacific during the months that followed. By late summer, American advances in the Marianas created new airfields that placed Japanese home waters within reach of long-range bombers. Carrier groups gained forward bases. Supply lines shortened. Each step tightened the pressure on a naval force already weakened by early losses. The Japanese Navy faced a shrinking perimeter and fewer resources with which to defend it. Harder's actions did not decide the battle alone, but they reshaped the timing, the alignment, and the readiness of a fleet that had once been the pride of an empire. The world after the Philippine Sea battle moved toward a new phase of the conflict. American industry continued to produce ships and aircraft at a pace unmatched by any opponent. Allied strategies across the Pacific gathered momentum. The collapse of Japanese carrier aviation signaled a turning point understood by military planners in Washington, London, Canberra, and Chongqing. The balance had shifted, and it would not return. In that broader arc, Harder's patrol stood as a reminder of how a small vessel, guided by a determined crew, could influence events far beyond the limits of her steel hull. The submarine operated in silence, far from headlines. Yet her actions touched decisions made in flagships, war rooms, and command centers across the Pacific and beyond. The trajectory of Harder's story stretches across the Pacific like a narrow wake that refuses to fade. Her patrols began as one more thread in a vast naval campaign, but they grew into something larger, something that reached beyond the steel of a single submarine. The battles she fought near Tawi Tawi reshaped more than local waters. They altered the timing of a major fleet movement, shifted the balance of a crucial engagement, and demonstrated that a small crew operating in silence could influence decisions made far beyond their horizon. When Harder sailed from Fremantle after her June patrol, the crew carried both pride and fatigue. They understood the danger of returning to sea. Submarine duty offered no illusions. Every man knew the risks held beneath each dive. Yet they accepted the next mission with the same quiet resolve that had carried them through narrow passages and rising pressure. They followed a commander who believed that aggression, executed with precision, could break the rhythm of enemy forces, and time proved him right. Harder's final patrol ended in darkness south of Dasol Bay. The sea closed over her hull, sealing the fate of 79 men whose courage had shaped one of the most consequential submarine operations of the war. Their loss was not announced with fanfare. It arrived as a brief notice, a line in a wartime bulletin, a conclusion marked by respect rather than detail. Families learned of the loss through telegrams that left questions unanswered. Only after the war did the full account find its way into official records. In the years that followed, naval historians traced the effects of Harder's contributions with clarity. They saw how 4 destroyers lost in 4 days forced the Japanese mobile fleet to depart Tawi Tawi early. They studied the consequences of that timing on reconnaissance, fuel, readiness, and fleet alignment. They connected these factors to the outcome of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. They noted how American submarines, encouraged by Harder's example, began adopting more assertive tactics against warships, leading to a shift in doctrine that influenced the final year of the conflict. Yet the deeper meaning of Harder's story lies not only in tactics or outcomes. It lives in the quiet courage of the men who served aboard her. They were sons of farmers, mill workers, machinists, and teachers. They came from inland towns as well as coastal cities. They stepped into a world of red-lit compartments, steel bulkheads, and long patrols that blurred day and night into a single rhythm. They learned to trust each other with their lives, and they learned to face fear without letting it define them. Underwater warfare required a kind of endurance that did not appear in photographs or newsreels. It demanded patience as much as boldness, calmness as much as daring. Moments of violent action were followed by long stretches of silence, where every sound might signal danger. The men aboard Harder lived inside that tension. Their bravery was not loud. It was steady. It moved through routine tasks, watch rotations, torpedo checks, and quiet conversations shared in cramped spaces. It showed itself when the hull trembled under the force of a depth charge, or when the crew worked together in darkness after a pipe burst or a light failed. The discovery of Harder's wreck in recent years offered a moment of reflection for families who had waited decades for answers. The images of her hull resting upright on the sea floor carried a solemn beauty. Her conning tower still rose from the deck. The damage from depth charges remained visible. The sea had claimed her, but time had preserved her shape. For relatives of the men aboard, the discovery provided a place to imagine their final moments, and a measure of comfort in knowing that the submarine had come to rest in dignity. Harder's legacy belongs not only to the past, it continues to resonate in naval academies, training centers, and archives where her patrol reports are studied for their clarity and discipline. Her aggressive tactics are analyzed not for imitation but for the insight they offer into human judgment under pressure. They show how a commander shaped by experience can alter the expectations of an enemy. They show how courage, when balanced by skill and restraint, can open paths that once seemed impossible. At Arlington, where Commander Day is buried, his headstone carries simple words. They speak to duty and service rather than glory. Visitors who pause there often reflect on how many untold stories lie behind each inscription. Harder's story, preserved through reports, citations, and the memories of survivors, reminds us that history is built from such lives. The submarine and her crew shaped events far beyond what they could see from the confines of their pressure hull. Their actions became part of a larger tide that moved the war toward its final chapters. In the end, the image that remains is not one of battle alone. It is the image of a submarine rising through early dawn, her wake drawn thin across calm water, her crew prepared for whatever lay beyond the horizon. It is the image of men working together in silence, trusting one another in moments when seconds mattered. It is the image of a vessel that changed the course of a fleet through courage measured not in volume but in resolve. As we remember the men of Harder, we honor more than a list of victories. We honor their discipline, their endurance, and the example they left for those who came after. Their legacy continues in the stories we preserve and in the quiet lessons drawn from their service. Their courage belongs to history, but the meaning of that courage endures in the present. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these memories alive. If you would like to explore more stories of sacrifice, strategy, and the hidden battles beneath the surface of the Pacific War, don't forget to subscribe WW2 Secret Archives before checking out the next video in the end screen.